So let us very patiently and very slowly start writing the program. This program I will try to write in a very modular fashion, in the sense that there will be a lot of functions and much of the code will go in those functions. There will be very little code in the main function. First I will try to rename my pins. We should remember that we have connected RS and enable to P2.0 and P2.1 respectively, and also read, write and interrupt pins of ADC to P2.2, P2.3 and P2.4, and also we have connected LEDs, two LEDs, green LED 2.5 and red LED to 2.6, and port 1 is connected to the data pins of LCD and port 3 is connected to the data pins of ADC. My first line, hash include regx51.h. So renaming the pins. S bit, I will name the RS P2.0 pin, actually that is connected to RS, as RS LCD, that's P20. And similarly the enable pin of LCD, I will name it EN LCD, EN underscore LCD, it's connected to P21. I am renaming the P21 as enable LCD. Then I will rename P22, P22, P23, P24, P25 and P26. P22 is connected to a read pin of ADC, so I will name it RD underscore ADC. P23 is connected to write of LCD, write of ADC, so I will rename it as WR ADC. P24 is connected to the interrupt pin of ADC, so I will rename it as S bit INTR underscore ADC. And P25 is connected to green LED. I will rename it as PLED green, and then I will rename P26 as LED red. Then the ports, I can similarly rename the ports using SFR commands. SFR, I have two ports, port 1 and port 3. Port 3 is the output of ADC, so I will rename it as D out, digital out. OUT. And similarly the data pins of LCD, I will rename that port that's connected to P1, I will rename that as LCD data, LCD data equal to port 1. I forgot to put the terminators. Is that fine? Now I will leave some space for function prototypes. Maybe I will start my program here, void main. So the first thing I will be doing in main is declaring my variables, what variables I know. I remember at this point I only remember two variables which I need to initialize. Maybe during the process of writing the program I will remember some other variables, or maybe I will need some other variables. I will initialize them then only. So I will also keep some space here. The two variables I remember is one for the input data which we are getting from ADC. Since that is an 8-bit data, let me initialize that as char, and I will name that as digital data. And then this digital data will be converting in temperature, so that's an integer. So I am also declaring that temperature int temp for temperature. Then I will again leave some space. So now what is my first step usually when I write any program for any embedded system, for any microcontroller? My first setup is to configure the ports, make them input or make them output. But I will not be configuring the ports inside the main loop. In fact, I will be calling a function that will configure the ports. Let me name that function as anything configuration or config underscore ports. So this function, well, I will define this function. This will actually configure the ports as input or as output ports. After that, my second step will actually be to initialize my LCD. I will call that function as initialize init Lcd. These two things I only have to do once in the program. I have to configure the ports once, and I have to initialize the LCD once. What I have to do after that? After that, I have to read the data from ADC. After reading the data from ADC, I have to convert reading ADC, and then I have to convert it into temperature, two things, and then I have to display it on LCD. And also I have to determine the status of my LEDs. I have to turn them on or off. So these are the four main things. I will make 4 different functions for these 4 things. But since these 4 functions I have to do repeatedly, meaning that I have to check the temperature, I have to read the ADC after every instant, and then I have to display that, then I have to change that into temperature, then I have to display it on LCD. I have to keep on doing it time and again. So I will write these 4 functions inside an infinite while loop, or inside infinite for loop, basically inside any infinite loop that will run again and again. So I can simply write like this: while 1 start writing my functions. My first function is to read ADC data, but this time after reading ADC data it will return a value that value I have to store in digital data, the variable I have created here. So my digital data will be equal to what a function returns. That function I will name as read ADC. This is separate from the program. And then my second thing is, I have read this data, digital data. I have to convert into temperature. So I will call another function. That function will take digital data as input and return temperature. The temperature I will store in temp, meaning temperature, equal to, I will call another function, convert data, and to this function I have to pass the value which I have read in the previous function, digital data. Is that okay? After reading the value and converting it into temperature, I have stored that temperature in temp. Then I have to display this temp on an LCD. I will call another function. I will name that this LCD. Display LCD temp, and I will pass a value that is temp to it, because I have to temperature. The display LCD temperature function should know what value it has to display, and on that value it also have to display some other message which we have discussed earlier. And then after these three things are done, we have the last thing, that is changing the status of LEDs. That I also will do using a function LED status. That function should also know the value of temperature, so I will pass the value of temperature to that function also. So I think that is my program. I will close the while loop, and also I will close my main loop. So I have basically called 6 functions inside my main loop. The first function is to configure the ports. The second function is to initialize the LCD, and then these two functions I have already only called once, and then I am again and again calling 4 functions. I am calling a function read ADC, that will read the value of ADC and return a value that will be stored in the variable dig data. And then I am calling another function convert data, that will actually convert the data, digital data which we have read previously, into temperature. And then I am calling the third function that is actually displaying this temperature along with a message on LCD. And then I am in the fourth function, I am changing, in the sixth function actually, I am changing the status of the LEDs depending upon the temperature, the present temperature. Outside the main, I have to write the function prototypes. So first function is config ports. It doesn't return any value, so I will write void config ports the next function prototype will be for Init Lcd, so that also goes like void init lcd init lcd, another for the function that reads the ADC but that returns a char value, so the function will be char read ADC. And then next function is convert data from digital data to temperature, that also returns a value and that value is int. So we will declare the function prototype like this: int convert data temp, and that also is actually we pass a value to it, that value is char, so we have to write a char here. And next function is displaying on LCD. So I have named it differently. This function, the convert data temp, I have named it different. Convert data only, so I will write function like this: int convert data and passing the value char. And then the next function is displaying on LCD, that's not returning any value, so that will be void disp LCD temp. I am passing a value integer to it, so int. And then the last function for now, that is also not returning any value, so void led status, void led status, and we are also passing a value int to it. So for now the program is easy. Till now I have renamed the ports and pins that show their actual function, and then I have actually called 6 functions and declared their prototypes before main. In main I have declared 2 variables: digital data, that will actually storing the data out of ADC, that is input to the that's input to the microcontroller, and then microcontroller is changing this data into temperature. So I have declared another variable as int, I have named that temp, and then inside I have called 6 functions. 2 of them I will be calling only once. The first function will actually be configuring the ports as input or as output, then I will be initializing the LCD, the second function, and then inside an infinite loop I have called 4 functions. The first function is reading the data from ADC, storing that in a variable named digital data, and then another function named convert data is taking the digital data as input and returning back the temperature. The temperature will be calculated from digital data using the formula which we have already discussed. And then in the third function we have the temperature. We are passing this temperature value to our third function, display LCD temp as so that function will be displaying this temperature on LCD. Along with the temperature, it will also be displaying a message which we have already discussed what kind of message. And then the fourth function will actually be changing the status of LEDs, 2 LEDs, green LED and red LED, depending upon what temperature we have detected. So now we will be simply actually writing the function definitions. We will start with config ports, that is the easiest one, and then we will move to init lcd, read adc, convert data, display lcd, and led status functions. So our first function to be defined is config lcd. Void config ports ports ports. So what ports we have to configure? We have to configure port 3 as input port, because data is input to microcontroller, and we have to configure port 1 as output port. So first these two ports, port 1 as output port, port 1 as output port 0x00, and then port 3 as input port. Then we have to port 2. How we are going to define port 2? Port 2, here we can use we can define port 2. I can show you how to define port 2. It's a 8-bit port, we know that. P2.0 is connected to the RS of LCD, that will be output. So to P2.0 we have to write 0. P2.1 we also have to write 0. P2.2 connect to the, and P2.3 connect to the RD and WR of ADC, both output pins 0 and 0 will go there. And then to INTR, ADC is an input pin to ADC, to microcontroller, output from ADC, so a 1 will be written here. And then we have two more pins, 2.5 and 2.6. 2.5 and 2.6 again output pins, so zeros and zeros. We have not used 2.7, so maybe we make it an output pin. The better methodology here is actually not to change the status of pin 2.7. So I actually have to write this data to port 2, that is 10 in hex. So I will be writing 10 to port 2010. That completes my first function. I have successfully written config ports function, and this function only configures the ports, it doesn't do anything else. In fact, I should not have written, or this, I can use P1 here, or even I can use the name of P1, that is LCD data, anything I can use here.